Hey, welcome, Production Institute fans. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about Ethernet cables. I've been running into a similar problem in many different places concerning digital consoles and how they're connected to computers, how you would connect computers. Some consoles, it's very straightforward. You can connect via a USB cable, such as the PM5D. You just simply need a Type A connector to Type A connector, which is Hello, YouTube fans of the Production Institute. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Ethernet cables and USB cables and how they connect to different digital consoles. There seems to be a lot of confusion. I run into this a lot when I'm doing installations or helping different organizations set up their systems, and I find that they're often frustrated that they can't connect their laptops directly to their consoles. And there could be several reasons for that, so I'm going to cover a couple of them here. First of all, some consoles, especially the larger digital consoles, you can connect directly via a USB cable, say like a PM5D, a Yamaha PM5D. The one thing is you'd have to have a cable that has A-type, alpha-type connectors on both ends. And that is that's a standard USB cable with an alpha connector on each end. You'd connect it to your computer and then one to the back of the console itself. Unlike these B-type connectors, like they use from a printer to an A-type to a B-type USB, you will occasionally see those like on an O1V, Yamaha O1V, and some other types of consoles. But again, those are not generally meant for direct connection to your computer. They usually have some other devices in mind when they're set there, except for the 5D. The 5D is meant to connect your laptop directly to it via USB-A connectors. Where you really get into a difference in different consoles is consoles that are set up to be to be controlled via a local area network connection. And often plugging your laptop in via standard LAN cable, what doesn't work, and people get very frustrated. They try and set the IP addresses and what have you, and there's a really simple basic reason why you can't use a standard LAN cable to connect your computer, your laptop computer, to say an M7CL. This particular wire is wired in what's known as the T568B configuration. The B configuration superseded the 568A configuration years ago. 568A was an AT&T design that evolved being able to send both computer data and telephone data over the same type of connector, or using one type of connector that was interchangeable. With the introduction of gigabit or 100 megabit, 10 and 100 megabit computer systems, 568B took over, and the wiring became slightly different. These are wired in 568B. I have a small chart here, and I'll just show you. I'll put a photo up of it a little later in the video. But as you can see, there's a very specific order for this 568B: yellow, white, yellow, green, white, blue, blue, white, green, brown, white, brown. And both ends of the cable have to be wired exactly the same for this cable to operate in a normal computer environment. But what most people don't understand is that without a router in between, because you connect computers usually via a router, and without a router you can't simply plug up two laptops together with a 568B type connection. They just simply won't talk to each other, and that's because you have to, the cable's not really meant for bi-directional communication between two devices without a router. So instead, what you need to make is a crossover cable, which is still a 568B crossover cable, but as you can see, the two ends have to be wired slightly differently. And again, I'll put this image up here in just a few minutes at the end of the video. But this is called a crossover cable. And a crossover cable will allow your M7CL to talk directly to your laptop. You'll have to configure your local area network within your laptop to a specific IP address, and then assign the board also to that same specific IP address, which is all in the user setup of an M7CL. You can also use a crossover cable to connect two laptops together so that they will actually communicate and pass files together without the aid of a router. And many people are unaware of this. If you have a laptop and you have large files that you want to move from one to another, or just say a laptop and a desktop, and you don't have a router, if you can make yourself a crossover cable, this will help that speed up that process a great deal. Now, to make these cables, you requires a crimp tool. Crimp tool and a box of blank RJ45s that haven't been crimped. And of course, some Cat5e or Cat5.6 cable. The 568B standard is set to be outmoded in the near future by 568C, which will be used for gigabit Ethernet connections, and in which all 8 pins are used. And that's really the difference between these A, B, and C connections. The A connection generally uses only 4 of the conductors of the 8 conductors, and so does the B, but just in a slightly different way. But you can also use the B to support both a telephone and a data system at the same time. And C will use all 8 conductors for gigabit Ethernet traffic. So it will be, in other words, just using all 8 for wider bandwidth across the wire. So when you're setting up an M7CL and you're trying to hook up your computer to it, the first thing you're going to have to do is get yourself a crossover cable. You can purchase one of these from a local supplier. This is a cheap one from a company that shall go nameless, and they're about $40, and they're reasonably good. But if you're going to make a lot of cables, or you're in the business of making Ethernet cables, you probably want to purchase a higher grade crimping tool, a compression tool, because they can be, this tool in itself, although cheaper, can actually have some difficulty in getting the crimps just right every time. And so you get what you pay for. In other words, spend a little bit more money on a better tool, and you'll tend to get more consistent results when you're crimping RJ45 connectors onto the Cat5 cable. So just a word of caution there. The cheaper tools don't always work so great. Sometimes you've got to re-crimp them or cut them off, start all over again, which can be kind of a pain. So now we're going to talk about exactly how to make these cables. I'm going to cut a little piece of Cat5 cable and show you how to deal with the wires in it, because it can be a little tricky. And the wires are 4 twisted pairs, and it's essential that you don't untwist the pairs very far. The twisting in the pairs is to avoid crosstalk between the different wires, and also improves the shielding and its rejection of RF to some degree. So it's important to get these RJ45s crimped on in a very specific fashion, and one of the next things we're going to do here is look on how to do that. So what we have here is some standard Cat5 cable. I'm going to cut a piece off of it here using my tool. these crimp tools are actually very handy in that they do two things. They have a set of blades on one side that simply cut only the outside covering, the blue covering. Sometimes it's white, sometimes it's blue, you never know. And then they have another cutter on the other side that cuts cleanly through the entire cable. So the idea is that you set your cable in with, I always keep the side that's going to cut only the insulation, outer insulation, on the inside of my right hand. If you're left-handed, keep it on the inside of yourself. And then you want the wire, looking at it closely, you'll see that the wire, you don't want to stick the wire too far through, because this is the precise length. I've already cut this, so I'm going to crimp it again, and I'm just going to give the wire, you see, a half twist, and off comes the outer cover. Now, since I cut it before, I can see that I've mangled these wires. It may be hard to see here close up with this autofocus. I'm not sure that it'll get it. But I actually cut off a wire by accident there. So this makes this useless. You have to look very carefully and make sure that you haven't stripped any of these accidentally or cut one of the 8 wires, one of the 4 twisted pairs. So the simple thing to do is just to start over. I'll cut this cable off. Again, I have the insulation cutter on the inside. I'm going to set this so that the insulation cutter doesn't cut. And I'm going to rotate around once. Oh, I still got one that time. So it's just, you have to be careful. Some people prefer to use a sharp knife to cut this insulation off, but it's a better tool will generally do this job very effectively. So let's try this one more time here. See if I can. That time we got a clean cut, and you can see that there are the 4 twisted pairs. I'm going to pull them apart. There's brown, white, brown. There's green, white, green. There's orange, white, orange. And there's blue, white, blue. So I'll fly in these charts as I do this. For now, we'll just look at how these you can see that they're a little bent up and not exactly very straight. And to get these to slide into the connector, you really have to kind of clean them up. First of all, they have to be put in the right order. In this case, I'm going to show you put an end on for just a standard 568B connector. And in that case, it goes orange, white, orange. And what I do is I take my fingers and I straighten each cable out, each little miniature cable, get the bends out of it and get it straight first. So we go orange, white, orange, blue, white, green. It's the blue, white right here. Oh, guess I'd cut through it. I just pulled off that. Gotta start over. This is not an uncommon process. I've had to, if you do this a lot, you certainly get better at it. But don't take any chances when you're making these cables. If it seems like there's a weak conductor, you should immediately just go ahead and chop the end off the conductor and start over with the stripper. So we're back to simple, straightforward. Again, I'll separate these. Orange, white, orange. I didn't get very much cut off on this. And you don't want to cut very much of this blue insulation off the outer shield, because it's important to keep as much of it. When we crimp this, the crimp is actually going to connect to really crimp this outside blue protective cover, and that's what's going to hold that RJ45 in place. So we've got here. Sometimes it also helps to have magnifying glass to do this job. So, after you've cut it off and used the tool to get them just the right length, the next thing to do is separate them out in groups, in pairs. So we've got orange, white, orange, blue, white, blue, green, white, green, brown, white, brown. In 568B, you start with the orange, white is first. And again, I use my fingers to sort of straighten out each cable as best I can. So we go orange, white, orange, green, white, blue, blue, white, green, and brown, white, brown. So as you can see, I've sort of got these fanned out now into the correct order. I don't know whether this autofocus is close or not. It's trying to anyway. There we go. So, but fanned out like that, as you can see, is not really going to work very well. They all have to fit into this nice square connector here. And in order to do that, we need to sort of bend them into shape. So the first thing that I do is to straighten these out somewhat. Make sure that each wire is nice and straight. Flip this over because we want the orange, white, orange, green, white, blue, blue, white, green, brown, white, brown. Now you don't want to untwist these wires any farther than about this 1/4 of an inch. You could cause problems for yourself a little later on. So it's important always to do not untwist these wires any farther than you have to get them straight. So by straightening, what I do is I make a little bend in the first outside, most outside ones. Brown, white, brown. And get the very tips of the wires as straight as possible. Orange, white, orange, green, white, blue, blue, white, green, basically get them bunched together straight as possible. The RJ45 connectors have some small grooves internally that make this job much easier once you've got the wires basically straightened out. And you have to hold them tightly in your hand. So now, as you can see, what I've done, so we get the autofocus here, is I've got them in the right order and shaped in the right way so that they're going to be fairly easy to slide into the connector. But first, I want to make sure, if you notice, they're slightly crowned. Not all of them are exactly the same length. And what I'm going to do next is take the cutters, holding them very securely in place. I'm going to just cut off maybe 1/16 of an inch, and so that they're extremely evenly cut, or their lengths are exactly the same, so I should say. So now we have a much straighter. So we get the autofocus to go here. See, I've got a nice straight cut across the top of those. So the next step is to slide these wires. Again, check your order. Make sure everything is in the right order. Orange, white, orange, green, white, blue, blue, white, green, brown, white, brown. Just get one of these out of order and the cable will not function. So, taking the RJ45 connector with the spring part on the bottom. You can see there's a little spring connector that holds it into the jack. You want it on the bottom, holding it on the bottom. Look facing the pins, so you're facing the pins and can see them. And I'm going to slide these 8 pair into the connector. As I said, there's some slots built in. It's very hard to get the autofocus to focus on this thing this close. But if you look closely in there, you can see that there's some slots. And each slot for a wire to go in. And not only that, as you push the wire in, you can look from the side and you can see when the wire hits the edge, when the wires have come all the way up to the end of the connector. You can very clearly see it. And these copper contact points actually have sharp edges on the inside. So with each wire slid into the precise slot and in the right order, once I use the crimp tool, it's actually going to force these copper connectors to slice down inside the wire and make contact with the copper wire that's inside of it. But first I'm going to look at this closely. If you flip it over, look at the back side, bend the connector keeper up just a little bit so you can clearly see the back side of the connector. And you can examine your wire order one last time before you crimp it. Orange, white, orange, green, white, blue, blue, white, green, brown, white, brown. We're in the right order. The wires are all touching the very end of the shaft into the RJ45. The next thing we're going to do, and you can also notice that the blue jacketing here, get the autofocus, is inside the crimp zone. This is the crimp zone right here, and this is where the connection is made to the computer. You always want some of the outer jacket in the crimp zone. That's what's going to hold these wires into place. I take my tool and slide the connector, physically slides into the compression tool. And it has a set of pins. And then you got to crush it as hard as you can. And then inspect it. Generally, it's too tight of, I can't get the autofocus to get close enough for you to see this. Maybe it'll autofocus, maybe not. But as you can see, now that there's a crimp right here in this plastic, and it is crimped to the blue cable. So this thing won't pull off here, not very easily. You'd have to really pull on it hard in order to get it off. So this is a standard 568B wiring. Now, if we're going to make this into a crossover cable, once we get to the other end, we have to have a little different wiring order. I'm going to go ahead and strip the end here. Again, it's the same process. We're going to go through, try and get the autofocus to work here. It's not going to do it very well. Separate each twisted pair first of all to start with. I'm using a magnifying glass here so I can clearly see these wires, because otherwise it's very easy to mix them up. Sometimes the white wires have very tiny color strips on them, and since there's 4 of them, it's quite easy to get them mixed up. So you have to look very closely. You have to have eagle eyes or just use a magnifying glass. So I'm going to get them all straight, first of all. Keep them loosely grouped together even though I've untwisted them slightly, straightened them. For example, as you can see, I've just made it so that they're all nice and even as far as getting them straight. Want them all as straight as possible. Yeah, so for the crossover for end number 2, the wiring is quite different. I wired this end orange, white, orange, green, white, blue, blue, white, green, brown, white, brown. For this end, it goes quite different. It goes green, white, green, yellow, white, brown, yellow, blue, and blue, white. Wiring this end in this fashion will make this a crossover cable. So again, I've got them tightly held together in the right order. See if we can get it to autofocus here. Not going to do it. Maybe you can see that now. It's an autofocus. So that order is on the opposite end. It's what makes this a crossover cable. And again, it's a little crowned as far as the lengths go. So I'm going to take my cutters. I'm going to cut it so all wires are exactly the same length. And get a very nice, even, straight cut across. As you can see, it's very even. Same process again. I'm going to check my color coding one last time. Green, white, green. Orange, white, brown, white. Brown, orange, blue, blue, white. It's in the right order. I'm going to take another blank, uncrimped RJ45. Carefully slide these into the slots. I'm going to push them in until I get them seated, so I can see from on looking through the side of the connector. I can see when the wires are pushed all the way in. Look at both sides, make sure they're pushed all the way in. And then I would crimp this, and we'd have a basic crossover cable. And it wouldn't matter which end you connected to which device. Proper thing here is this is now a crossover cable, and two computer devices will now speak to each other, communicate with each other over a single wire without a router in between it. And so the answer to this question of connecting your laptop to your M7CL is to create a crossover cable. Now you can go and buy these. There's several different types of places, both online and local retailers, that will sell you a crossover cable. Usually they carry them. But if you're going to be making cables and face it, Ethernet type systems and systems using Ethernet cables will be ubiquitous in the audio world in the next 5 years. And it's one of those skills you just need to learn how to do. It's just like soldering. You need to learn how to make these cables, make them efficiently, and visually identify the difference between the 568A, 568B, and then a crossover cable. And it can be done very simply by looking at these things. And it's important to use the right cable for the right situation. So, if you're wondering, if you have an M7CL in your church or something like that, and you're wondering why you can't get your laptop to talk to your M7CL, it's because you don't have a router or you don't have a crossover cable. The crossover cable gets rid of the need for a router. The beautiful thing with like an M7CL nowadays is you can set up a wireless router and then have your your iPad or a laptop or a notebook PC talk to wirelessly to the board and walk around and make adjustments, and that's a beautiful thing. But if you simply need to want to set up a laptop and connect it directly to your M7CL, this is how you do it: a crossover cable.